So today we'll be discussing the examiner report of October-November 2016, paper 1, History and Culture of Pakistan. Uh, this is from one of the past papers, and this basically talks about the fact how does the examiner grade certain questions and what is needed from the students to write properly and adequately in order to get good marks. So the first question is related to the source. According to source A, why was there opposition to the Simon Commission of 1927? Now, this is basically the source. Now, in source A, the Simon Commission 1927, it reads as the offer of the land of friendship from Congress is more valuable than any concession which with the British government is willing to make. This public meeting of the citizens of Bombay firmly declares that the commission which has been announced is unacceptable, and the people of India, as it denies the right of India to participate in equal terms, framing the future constitution of the country. It contains no Indian representation. Indians throughout the country should have nothing to do with the commission. We are not satisfied with the status of just being petitioners to this commission. So all of these points basically talk about the fact that the Indian people were not happy with the Simon Commission. Now, so here are some of the points which would give the full quota of 3 marks according to the exam. So reward each correct statement identified from the source with 1 mark up to a maximum of 3. So there was no Indian representation on the commission. That's the first one. Then value friendship with Congress more than British concession, not on equal terms, and not satisfied being only petitioners. So these are 4 points, and if any one of these is written, you will get a point for that. So there will be 1 mark for each point. Now, source B tell us about the negotiations during the round table. Now there are 3 levels, so there are levels to every answer, right? So you have to identify which exactly is. So the source B basically it's a political magazine, and it shows a car which is labeled as India. The year is 1931, being driven by a white man, and an Indian native is sitting in the back seat. So as the picture can clearly show that it is all about the idea of control, and like the question, the heading states, the question of control. And this is what the question is: what about changing places? Now the backseat person is asking the driver, what about changing places? Now John Bell, who was one of the leaders at that time, well, you're welcome to see what you can do at the wheel, but I think I'd better sit beside you within reach of the brake. Now, it's a very telling dialogue as to the kind of mindset the British of that time had for to the idea of Indian self-control. This is taken from the magazine John Bull is basically a character used in political cartoons as a national symbol to represent British in general. So it's kind of like Uncle Sam, where Americans use that figure, the British used John Bull. So what does source B tell us about the negotiations during the Roundtable Conference? Now, the first level is just talking about the main surface features of the source. That will only get 1 mark. That is just saying simply that Britain is in control of the car. Now, that just tells you one element within that picture. Then you have general vague statements which will get you 2 to 3 marks, but there is no point in writing stuff like the driver looks under pressure to give up control of the car. That's just a vague statement. It doesn't go deep into the analytical part of the picture. Now, since it's a 5 mark question, you need to realize that you need a little bit more depth in the question. So, some of the things that can be written are: the driver of the car is John Bull, who represents British interest at the negotiations. The car is traveling over bumpy ground, which represents the way that the negotiations went during these years. The Indian in the car, who represents their negotiations, wants to take control from the British, who are reluctant to give control. It suggests that the British feared the progress towards change, and that was their overall outcome. So they were always ready to hit the brakes, so to speak. And the final analysis can be around the fact that the source explains the political leaders in India were reluctant to attend because it shows that the decision had already been made by the British. So a lot of people, especially at the end, really thought that it was a useless and futile attempt to enter into an agreement. So part C. Explain the importance of the Government of India Act in 1935 to the future of the subcontinent. Now it's a 7 mark question. So according to the first level, the minimum basic level is just by stating the fact that it was used to govern India and more people could vote and there was provincial autonomy. So it was kind of like giving some sort of independence or semblance of autonomy to the provinces within the Indian subcontinent. Now, to get the maximum number of marks, which is out of 5 to 7, these are some of the points that should be considered while writing the answer. Some provincial autonomy was granted, which meant that every provincial government was allowed to devise and carry out their own programs and be responsible for their own legislature. This was the first time that this had been allowed, an important step forward. Ministers in the provinces could have control of all departments and they could veto a bill. It provided additional rights and it also gave provisions for federal government, which meant that princely states could decide and politically participate in the subcontinent, and however, the key decisions still remained with the British, and that was largely opposed by the Indians. Part D. How successful were the provincial elections in India in 1937? Explains your answer. Now, this is a long 10 mark question, so you have to understand that during the 1937 election, there were two parties, Congress and the Muslim League, right? So, and this happened right after the Government of India Act. So, these two parties then further on went to battle in different provinces, and Muslim League lost terribly during that time, and Congress won the election. But overall, in the larger scheme of things, this was a very useful endeavor for Indians in general, regardless of religion. because it was the first time that they had the right to elect their representatives. And since provincial autonomy was granted during the Act of 1935, that meant that people who were part of the ruling elite managed to do whatever they wanted to do within those provinces since they had provincial autonomy. Now, this question is more about two parts, just explained right now. So, for the fact that how successful it was for Congress was that the Congress won majority in 5 provinces and largest single party in 4 others. So that was huge at that time. And they saw themselves as the sole party representing the Indians. So the Congress thought that they were the only voice that the Indians needed, regardless of what religion of any division along religious lines. They thought that they are the major party within the Indian subcontinent. And they led to formation of cabinets within the 8 provinces. Now, for Muslims and Muslim League, this was the first major election they had fought, and it basically helped unify the Muslim League. It led to improvements in the organization and planning. They learned that their support lay in the area where Muslims are in minority rather than majority, because where the Muslims were in minority, they had to, seem as if they cared about their rights more, because Muslim majority areas rarely thought of Muslim League as an important party to begin with. Recognition of an image problem as its leaders were seen as not in touch with ordinary Muslims. So that was another problem, that a lot of people from the Muslim League were seen as elitist, power hungry individuals who actually did not care for the masses. Whereas Congress was seen as the party of the people. So there was a lot of difference in that regard. So these are the effects of how successful the elections were for both Muslim League and Congress. Less successful, well, for Hindus, they alienated the Muslim League, after which, so difficulties in the future negotiations. So this happened in 1947. So this is 3 years before the 1940 resolution that happened. So Congress alienating Muslim League at the 1937 election, and after winning, basically created a massive rift between the two parties. An attitude of Congress and Nehru hardened Muslim views towards a separate nation, and this actually made separation a more likely outcome than it would have been had Congress been a little bit soft in their attitude. Now, for Muslim League, it was by and large less successful because it was a relative poor performance in elections, as mentioned earlier. So out of 489 Muslim seats, the Muslim League won only 109. So as a party who wanted to be the voice of the Muslims, this was not a good outcome. In the Punjab, out of 86 Muslim seats, Muslims won only one seat, and others were taken by Punjab Unionist Party. So again, in Punjab, which was one of the largest provinces in the region, they only could muster one seat, which was really bad. And Muslims felt betrayed by the British, who were seen too concerned with getting new provincial governments running rather than being concerned with Muslim rights. So Muslims thought that the British do not care about Muslim rights at all. And then another reason was that once Congress finally got its dominance, they started use their own power to further upset Muslims during their rule. So this entire thing is the complete answer for a 7 to 10 mark question. And if you add a value added judgment to that evaluation, which means that if you evaluate or give a final analysis that during the 1937 election, Muslims finally realized that it was impossible for them to live with Hindus. So all of this plus a little note at the end, which is summing up the entire answer, will get garner a full 10 marks. So that's for question number 1. Now question number 2 in section B talks about who was Nana Sahab. Now, so these are some of the points. During the War of Independence, he led a revolt and killed British officers and other Europeans. So the important aspect is the War of Independence, Battle of Kanpur. He led a revolt and killed British officers. He had personal grievances against British for stopping his pension, so he led a whole-out revolt. A British force surrendered to him and his forces safe passage out of the area. He fired on the British on the barges, killing 300 women and children and the soldiers. He managed to escape and was never captured. So putting all of this in an answer will ensure the full quota of 4 marks. Why was the Britain so successful in expanding its control of the subcontinent between 1750 and 1850? So now again, this is a whole period of 100 years in which Britain took control. And the reason why they did that was because Muslims, Hindus, other minorities, they were all fighting amongst themselves, and there was no central rule. Even though the Mughals were still in power during this era, the Mughal rule officially ended in 1857, right, during the War of Independence. But during this whole 100 year after the death of Aurangzeb, a lot of Mughal rulers were weak and feeble and did not know what to do. So now a 7 mark answer demands for a slightly more elaborate explanation rather than going for simpler answers, right? So a level 3 answer, which is basically equal to a 5-7 mark answer, which is considered a good answer or good response, is talking about these points that are given here. For instance, the Battle of Plassey and Buxar gave the British the riches of Bengal and favorable trading rights with the local Nawabs. Talking about all of these important things during that 100-year period is an important aspect in getting good grades in this answer. This provided massive new resources and British could consolidate control. The British also introduced governor generals into the province who administered them on British lines and provided yet more control. So, as far as the control part is concerned, as much of a weak central control the Muslims had during that 100-year period, the British started getting those little pockets of control by giving governor generals autonomy on each province, so they had more control and more access than the local rulers. And lastly, the British army was more modernized as far as weapons and skills were concerned, so it was easy for them to assert their control on the region. Part C. Was the development of a Western education system the greatest achievement of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan? Explain your answer. Now, again, this kind of question is always in response trying to elaborate other things. So, for instance, you have to make sure that there is an explanation and development of the question, the statement of the question that yes, Western education system was one of the major reasons, but there were also other factors that mitigated the factors to Sayyid Ahmad Khan had done a lot more for the Muslims. Now, as far as Western education is concerned, in 1863 he founded the Scientific Society at Ghazipur, and the writings are made available and translated from English into Urdu since a lot of Muslims did not know English at that time. He established a Muslim college which led to Muslim Anglo Oriental College in 1876 and then the University of Aligarh, which was the important element in educating the people. In 1886, he set up Mohammedan Educational Conference with the aim of raising educational standards among the Muslims, since Muslims were considered illiterate and backward at that time. He devoted his time to improving position of Muslims through education. Now, these are some of the points regarding Western education, that how he tried to bring English and the ideas of Western education into the mainstream minds or the consciousness of the Muslim population. Other factors are he also tried to make sure that the British understand the Muslims as well. So it was not just a one-way street where Sayyid Ahmad Khan was just solely telling the Muslims to learn Western education, to bow down to the British rulers, but he was also trying to make sure that the British stop having this paranoia that the Muslims are out to rebel against the British. So in order for that to subside, he basically gave an explanation of the word Naz in an attempt to remove the misunderstanding of the British about Muslims. He was also aware that the British knew little about Islam and was offended by the book he read in Britain about the Prophet, and as a result wrote his own book correcting that many errors he had read. He believed that the relations with the British also could be improved by improving the understanding of Christianity by Muslims. He tried to overcome the writing Tayyibun Kalam, which pointed out the similarities between Islam and Christianity. He wrote a number of books following the War of Independence, showing the British that the Muslims were only partly to blame and that they were Muslims who were supporters of the British government. So these were very controversial things at that time, but Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan still managed to somehow say all of this and did not get killed for it, which was a very important thing. He felt that British should treat the Muslims and Hindus differently. So now here, this is what the other factors about the highlighting of the two nation theory. This is where Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan basically gave his basic idea of how he viewed Hindus and Muslims. He viewed them as two separate nations. He was the first person to and the next point is basically that he was the first person to express this point of view and became known as the two nation theory. And this is where the first signs of a separate homeland or the hope for Muslims to have a separate homeland was generated. And again, you end it with evaluating the fact that Western education and other factors played into Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's evaluating the Muslims. So that would garner for quota 14 marks. Now, part C. Describe what happened at Lucknow in 1916. So Congress agreed to concessions. Now, the Lucknow Pact is seen as one of the most equal footings in which agreements were made between the Congress and the Muslim League. This is the one and only time that the Muslim and the Congress, Muslim League and the Congress were at the same on the same page. They both wanted more seats in council, protection of minorities, provinces to have autonomy, proposals to be binding on the British. This was the first time joint agreement Congress accepted some of the part. Some form of partition needed. Home rule seemed a possibility, and Muslim League realized they needed to work with Congress. So this was a little false dawn at that time, where the Muslim League was kind of thinking that maybe, just maybe, they, the Congress and the Muslim League can work together towards a home rule without the British, where Muslims and Hindus can live side by side instead of getting a different separate homeland. Part B. Why did the Khilafat movement emerge? Now, the reason for Khilafat movement are a lot. The first thing is that Khilafat movement started because of the word Khilafat, in the sense that during the First World War, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire as it was known back then, sided with Germany, Austro-Hungary to fight the Allies, which included Britain, France, Italy, USA. So all of these people were basically, or all of these countries rather, were part of the Allied forces. Now Turkey was in direct fight with the British. So once the First World War ended and Britain won, defeating the Ottoman Empire, the Muslims of the subcontinent felt threatened, and they felt that their last semblance or the last bastion of Islamic Khilafat was under threat because of the British. So a whole movement was started to protect that particular Khilafat. And some of the reasons are that Muslims held the Caliphate of Turkey in high regard. That was a very important point. And they were not prepared to see Turkey split up after the war. So they wanted to see the Ottoman Empire as a whole, and they did not want to see the fact that all of these regions which the Ottoman Empire controlled would be given to the local people, and there will be different countries coming out of that. So they expressed their views to the British government during the war, who promised that no harm would be done to the Caliphate. Now, the British promised that the Caliphate or the Khilafat will not be harmed. But the irony being that after the war ended, reports from Europe suggested that British and French wanted to punish the Turks for the support of the Germans. And at the same time, the Khilafat movement was founded. So you don't have to go into the detail of what exactly happened after the Khilafat movement founded, because the question is just asking about why did the Khilafat movement emerge. So these are some of the reasons which should be made the focal point of a response to get the full 7 marks. Now part C. Was the partition of Bengal the main reason for the formation of the Muslim League? Again, now these questions are always asking for other things while making one particular aspect a focal point of something. So there is just not the partition of Bengal which was one of the main reasons. There are a lot of other things in play as well. But firstly, the answer is divided in two parts. The first part is talking about the fact that partition of Bengal was an important aspect. It cannot be sidelined. So Hindus protested against partition of Bengal. Muslims saw this as a sign that the influence of the Hindus over the British. So after protest from the Hindus, the British had to reverse this. And during that protest, there were a lot of assassination attempts, people getting killed, and all of those things basically led the British to reverse their decision, which basically gave the Muslims the thought that maybe this is not a good sign. The Muslims started to think about their own survival and political representation, because they thought that Congress itself was not very Muslim friendly. Muslims were also increasingly aware that their political rights would not be advanced if they continued to rely on the Indian National Congress. By not organizing a Muslim group, they would continue to be disorganized, disunited over the partition. So they would have different opinions altogether. So other reasons are the growth of a better understanding between the British and the Muslims that was reflected in the similar declaration in 1905. In 1905, a new liberal government had taken office that seemed likely to make changes in political representation, so Muslims felt that they needed their own political party. So for them, the timing was right. The Congress was seen as an organization which would only advance Hindu views as it dominated that India should be treated as a cultural and political whole and Hindi should be declared the official language. They did not feel they had the same influence as Congress with the British, so they felt that the Muslims lacked that influence. The growth of the extreme Hindu nationalist groups within the Congress, which demanded that Muslims be forcibly converted to Hinduism, was another scary aspect which the Muslims needed to fight. So, all of these things, and especially at the end, talking about evaluating the whole reason, will give you the full mark.